first off, what was your inspiration for the Obernewtyn Chronicles?
Um, I spent a lot of time when I was a kid trying to imagine a place where there wouldn't be adults and where there wouldn't be, any of the structures or the kinds of people that kids have to listen to and do what they're told. So I had a lot of, there was a lot of stuff around me as a kid I was trying to avoid. And so I always used to imagine, I used to daydream about this place that I would run away and I would find this abandoned place with a wall that was kind of obviously broken down a bit. And I would get in there and I would find that it was this abandoned place, and I would find all sorts of obviously necessary things like kettles, and I would discover I could reboot the electricity. So somehow it would all become livable. And then people started in my imaginings turning up and looking for refuge, always kids too. And I would always say they could stay. And we would talk about how it was going to be. And then the collective just grew. And it was years after I'd written Obernewtyn that I actually realized, wasn't it just a continuation of that daydreaming I was doing as a child, where I was just looking for, my family, my like-minded people. And I didn't feel I belonged. I must have been adopted or something, like everybody thinks. And and so, I was imagining this kind of ideal place where there would be nobody bossing anybody and we would all decide things, very socialist in the nicest way. So, yeah, in a way, I think that partly was where it came from. And the other part was my dad died in a car crash, and I did a lot of and that's like a nuclear apocalypse in the life of any kid. And then I did a project at school when I was in secondary school, early secondary school, on the atomic bomb, Manhattan Project. And all of those things coalesced into, a place where I could think about things that really bothered me, like how do you belong and how do you stay yourself if people want to rule you? How do you not be ruled, but also belong? And what does it mean not to fit in anywhere? And what kind of world would I really want to live in? How would I want to talk to people? And I would like there to be animals, and I would like to be able to talk to them. So it was wish fulfillment also. So it was just all those things, a place for me to think the questions that mattered to me mostly. So that was the inspiration, probably.
I always loved that there was the sort of the sense of belonging, the found family, and throughout the whole, it continued out through the whole series. It wasn't just a standalone theme just in the first book. It went through the whole series. So that really connected with me when I was reading through when I was growing up. Always remember reading it in year 6 and then continuing it on. I was always so excited. It's my favorite book to reread. So I love the
It's
sense of
interesting,
belonging.
I think that experience might, be, I didn't know it. For a long time, I was amazed and stunned and happy, but stunned at the reception it got. But then I think it is exactly what you've just pinpointed. I think that those people who came on board in a way entered that broken down wall and came into that world where things would be, we all yearned for things to be fairer and kinder, and many of those things were in there that we were, and yet there was always this realistic, if I can use that word, sense that the world was an inimical place and
Yeah.
it wasn't a kind place, and there was lots of difficulties out there, but the way to deal with them was together with courage and some kind of honor. So I think, young people especially are very idealistic, and they do have a strong sense of integrity because that's when it forms, when we're children, but also it hasn't been in any way compromised by the things that seem to happen to adults that force those compromises and make you move away from the pure sense of ideals that you have when you're young. So I think the book maybe chimes with those because I wrote it when I was that age.
Yeah. How did you choose which character to focus the series on? Because it's always it's the main character Elspeth that we continually hear from. So how did you choose that it was her perspective that you were going to write from?
Well, she came to me before all of the others, and she was a skin of I slipped into. She was, in some ways, she was me. Although I remember reading a review years ago in an American. Someone sent me a link to an American review where somebody said this is a very unlikable, prickly character. And I thought, yes, she was.
Yeah.
And I was. I wasn't prickly on the outside, but I was certainly prickly on the inside. I was wary and careful. I didn't trust anybody. I was a loner, and I was okay to be alone and lonely. Well, everybody's lonely, even with people sometimes. That's what I decided as a kid. Loneliness doesn't require you to be alone. Sometimes being alone is a lot safer and better and more comforting than being with people who are horrible to you. So, what was the question? I've got completely sidetracked.
How did you choose to
Oh, yeah, yeah.
one?
So I think I was, like many, I was only 14, and I was writing from the point of view of a character about my age, a girl. And so, she was the me type of character. And the others came along later, a bit at a time. I think the first one was where Matthew and Damien were the first people she has connections with Cameo and Selma, but it's those two boys. And I have younger brothers I was very, very close to. And so I think those boys are like my little brothers in some ways. But it's interesting because at the very end of the series, I really did I had no problem with that first person and seeing everything, doing all that vast story. I was inside Elspeth. That was no trouble. But at the end of the last book, as the book started to unfold, have you read the last one?
Yes, I
I
love
just don't know. At the end, as the last one began to unfold, I really thought, now what am I to do here? Because I really want to do justice to Dragon's story. She's a really important character. She wasn't in the early days. I knew there would be some important characters that I had very vague ideas about, but I didn't know much about her. When she came along, I didn't know much about her at all. She really was a beautiful gift the books gave me in a way. And as her story developed, she became really an important character for me on many levels. And I just didn't feel like I could do justice to her story through Elspeth's eyes. I just felt like I would have to bend Elspeth into a device in order. I could have done it. I could have invented all sorts of ways for her to see the story unfold, but it just didn't feel right. And it was also such a giant book by then.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, there are aspects of this story that Elspeth can't see. And in fact, that's life too. That
Yeah.
you don't see everything that happens in the world, even though you might want to. There are mysteries which you will never solve, even because people die sometimes before you can learn, what the answers to questions you might ask them. So I made this decision that I would not tell her. I would only tell the story as it was naturally told through her eyes, and it let me go to this thing I'd been sort of vaguely considering for a long time, ever since I sort of put Matthew out of the story for so many years. I always wanted to write about what happened to him, and I had thought at some point of folding it in to the series, but I just couldn't do it. I know she can see through his eyes, but I just couldn't do it justice in that way, or it would be a told story. And there's plenty of them in the series, told stories. But at the same time, I just thought this, he's an important character too. And
Yeah.
his story deserves to. So I'd always had this idea I might tell Matthew's story from Matthew's point of view. But as I got to the end, I thought, well, this is the perfect solution. But I don't know I think it will have to be told from both of their points of view. I don't know. I haven't made that decision finally yet. I have got the story plotted out to some extent, but because I know what happened to him. We know a lot of what happened by just reference, but there's all sorts of stuff that will be delicious to explore. But I just don't know yet how I will bring the story together. Will she be a character also from the start? Like or will we follow him for a big chunk of the way and then switch to her point of view? So that was something I had to solve with the point of view problem. So sometimes, you can't. It's funny, I'm doing an online series of master classes for the South Australian Writers Centre, and somebody asked me, we were talking about what makes bad fantasy, and someone said characters where they just skip to they switch point of view conveniently. And I thought at the time, what does conveniently mean? Because isn't everything you do
Yeah.
for convenience to some extent? But I think they meant without there being any reason that you want to tell something, that's the only reason you can tell it. Like a story requires you to figure things out, not take an easy solution. But so that is something that I think, well, I'll be facing exactly this question down the track. But I sort of trust the process. I think I will begin the story from his point of view, and maybe I'll tell it all from his point of view. Maybe I won't go to her point of view. Maybe he will always see her through his own eyes rather than, because he goes through a real arc with Dragon. He starts out being really repelled by her and disliking her and distrusting her, and then realizes he's terribly prejudiced and he's really wrong, and at some point he's driven her away by his behavior, and it's too late, and he realizes she has loved him, or he had the chance, and that's all gone. And then he comes back into the story again, and they have to deal with the consequences of that. So it's an interesting thought that he might carry the whole thing through to the end, and for him it'd be a story of very strong women. What is it like to be someone for whom women matter very, very much? First of all, Elspeth, and then down the track, Dragon. What does that mean, sort of thing, to unfold? And also, the Marion and the others who are strong too. So yeah. Anyway, very big sidetrack. So yeah, she was always just it. She was it. She's the ultimate character for me.
Well, was it difficult to write the conclusion to Red Queen to close out the series?
It wasn't, because I knew there would be this other, I had a door in, and I also knew this lovely thing that, that people who could guess it would guess, that because he's in contact, he can telepathically talk to Elspeth, and he can see some of what happens through Elspeth's eyes, and she can reach him in various ways. There's a chance to see a little bit more of her story as well. And that, that lovely, cyborg character, I'd love to actually write a story about that character all on its own too. So it just, and there's what happens in the desert. There's still the people living, in the desert, which we also want to see a little bit what happens to, Miriam in the end, and all the rest of it. So through his eyes, I think we could see many of those stories, or I can simply write it as a series of stories. That would be a possibility as well. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do that, because I think it's more satisfying for readers to read a full story. That said, Ursula Le Guin wrote this series of stories called Tales from Earthsea, which I found, brilliant, really, really brilliant. And I thought, if you reach that level, then maybe you can do it. But in general, I think I prefer a story that I might, as a writer, want to have that one story being told from and have that complete big story arc you get from a book, rather than the smaller, although sometimes very intense short story ones. So yeah, so it wasn't hard to finish on the level of closing it out, because I knew there would be that. And I also knew that, the Before Time Chronicles exists to be written, and those books will, if Elspeth could dream of Cassandra, then Cassandra will dream of Elspeth. So I can go back to Elspeth's story. So I knew that it's a porous thing, that as long as I'm alive, I can actually reach it. And if I'm not alive, I won't know. So I didn't feel she was shut to me. I did feel, where to end it. That was kind of like, I did pretty much know right from the beginning of the series it would end sort of there. End with her having achieved what she had achieved, that it wouldn't be without cost. I had thought that Gulfer would die. And I had thought that would happen. It would be that or Maraman, but probably Gulfer, because I couldn't bear to let Maraman die. And he has kind of really an interesting, strange story too, which we've only seen the edges of that. And it would be nice to kind of dip into that a bit more too. But, so I guess Maraman wouldn't let me kill Gulfer. She can't say any of this, but Maraman wouldn't let me do it. And I remember writing it and trying to, that was supposed to be the moment Gulfer died. And I was just devastated. And then Maraman, I saw him beginning to dig. And so I let him dig. And then I was just howling my eyes out as I was writing it, thinking, no. And then, of course, I couldn't do it, And I got a lot of letters from people. Well, a lot. I got some letters from people saying, you should have killed off more characters. And I know what they mean. They mean the cost of such a, so much is invested in this story. that I want the cost to be higher somehow, but I couldn't do it. Another writer might have been able to. I'm not very good at writing dark endings. So, I always have hope. So I have to go where my hope takes me.
What was your process for writing the Chronicles? Did you plan it out from the beginning, or did you just write it book by book?
I had an idea of, well, when I first started to write, I thought I was writing a trilogy. And what I meant by that I was writing a trilogy means that I understood from my reading that a series of books gives you a larger canvas on which to tell a story. And fantasy also allows that kind of scope that you often find that unless it's, an epic historical family thing, you don't get in realist fiction. So for me, one of the things I love about fantasy was this idea, not of an epic scope of time and history, but of an epic scope of, really big ideas that you carry through an arc of story. Like, what is honor? What does it mean to be, human? All of these are really big questions. And, a series was going to give me scope to explore those. I couldn't have said this as clearly back then, but that's certainly what I was on about. I was very philosophical, and I wanted to think about these big ideas. And I knew this would be a big story. And to me, 3 books was a big story. But I didn't know, I knew how the book was going to end. I knew how the series would end. Elspeth had to find these machines. She had to deal with them in some way, and that would be the end of the story after that. So I kind of knew. I knew she would be I thought she might be alone at the end. I didn't know if she would be alone at the end. I wasn't 100% sure. If she was alone, there would be some possibility of getting back to Rushton again. So I knew that they would have one another at the end. And I knew something would be sacrificed. People would go along the way, but I didn't know who. When I wrote the second book, I had I was building my idea, and I moved from it being, Obernewtyn being an inimical place to being a place of protection and safety, which they were beginning to build their world inside of. And so I knew that's the arc of the story. But if someone had asked me to do all that building in one book, I couldn't have done it and told a story as well. The building would have taken over, whereas this way it could happen through the eyes of the characters as everything sort of unfolded. So, yeah. So I think when I reached Ashling, the Stone Key, really, that was a great big elbow of a book. I thought I'd finished it, then I realized I hadn't. It was in Ashling that I realized what the whole thing was about at some deep level. I realized that it was about the fact that they kept losing when you'd think with all these abilities, how do they go on losing? And in fact, they don't lose. In every sense, they define themselves more strongly. And in Ashling, when Rushton is sitting on the rock lamenting the fact that they lost this really important battle, and Elspeth goes to him and says, but you didn't lose. We know what we are now. We know what we can't do, what we can't be. We have, and it's a beautiful limitation, and it's we can't do some things that those people do. It's this moment when you realize humanity is really diverging into what it can't be and what it must be, what it must grow and evolve. Like we as a race must grow and evolve. I think it's a lesson we could learn out there in the world, actually. Yeah. So I kind of knew much more strongly where it was going to go then. But it did grow, the idea. Like I had vague ideas, but it wasn't until I was in the story and the characters were moving forward and looking that I began to see things. I think the really interesting thing about writing the Before Time Chronicles, I'll also have to world build in a science fiction way to do that, because it's the future of now. Yeah. So I'm actually writing a speculative fiction book that's set in the future of Canberra at the moment. So I can see how it comes easily. And I wrote that one short story to try it out. I don't know if you've read those short stories that are, yeah. So I wanted to try out that world to see what it felt like in the future. And I thought, yeah, I can do this. I can get the feel of that world really in that same organic way. I don't have to invent everything as a world building exercise separate. I can actually, come to it as I go. So I think by the Stone Key, I knew where the series was really going. I knew exactly what had to get there. But it was still a lot of story to tell at that point. And when I started what I thought was going to be the last one, and realized there was no way I could fit this into one book and do justice, and that it had to, split into two books. Then that's when I really knew, the final book was going to be a whopper. So
What are the differences between writing a YA series and a middle grade series? Because you've got Little Fur and The Kingdom of the Losts, which you've just released the latest book a couple of
yeah,
years ago.
I really loved those younger series. I wrote Little Fur because that little character appeared in my stories to Adelaide, my daughter, which you might know the story about that, and based on a flood that happened in Prague where we were living, and our walks and the puppets I used to have with her, and it grew out of our fantasy imaginary life, sort of in a way like everything. But she was my partner in this, and she was little. And the questions she asked were questions of a little girl. And so I bent those, the whole story was aimed at her, and we were building it between us. So it was very much written, I think you can read them as an adult and be interested, but at the same time, they're not cut off from anyone else. And when I'd finished doing Little Fur, I enjoyed it so much. And I just wanted to draw something else. And these little characters of Billy and Jludi had been with us for, since she was 3. And I thought, well, and I'd drawn her some little books, so they were the obvious, but there was no story connected to them. So I just began to build their story based on the fact that inside these little secondhand toys were these mechanical things which we could feel, and we didn't know what they were. So we were always guessing what was inside them. So it sort of grew out of that. And so the story, instead of me telling it to Adelaide, I just wrote it directly onto the page. So I think it's more complex than the Little Fur stories. One of my brothers who reads my books said to me, that is so complicated for little kids. And I said, I just write the books. Someone else will either explain them to their child or whatever. And that was, I think it was maybe the Cloud Road or maybe the last one he read that he said, I think it was the last one, not the Cloud Road, it would have been the Ice Maze. He said, that was so complicated. And I said, well, it's a complicated, I think it's one of the most original stories I've ever written. And I'm about to take it to Japan to some Japanese translators because I think it would work really well in the Japanese style of filmmaking animation. And I think it's really original. I think it would, I don't think it's an ordinary story. No. And I can say that about everything that I've written. I think it's eminently filmable, but as an animated series or stop motion or something like that. So I'm taking it over there. Illustration is very much a part of those ones, I think. For me, I draw as I write. Like sometimes I draw before, like I'm going to Japan, as I said, and I want to write one more of them. I wanted to write 2 more, and the publishers said no. And I thought, frankly, screw you, I'll write them if I want.
Yeah.
That their decision is based on this really big, bizarre thing. And I said to them, your rationale is stupid. You tell me that the 4th book has sold less than the 1st book. But what you don't realize is that the 4th book the 2nd book sold less than the 1st one, because when people read the 1st one, they read the 2nd one. And then some people, they recommended it, and some people went back and bought the 1st one. Yeah. And then the 3rd one came out and people read maybe 2 or 3, and then they went back and bought maybe the 1st one or the first 2. So there'll always be more. But the thing is, the later books also increased the sales of the first 2. So yes, it's always going to be that shape, but it doesn't mean anything. And I couldn't make them see it. And so, because they say after 1 year, it goes into paperback and then it comes out of print. And I'm just not into that. So they feel there wasn't enough sales to make it worthwhile. And I thought, well, I don't care what you think. I really want to write those stories. So at the moment, my plan is to take the Billy and Jludi characters in my head with me to Japan. And I've got a month there, and I'm just going to spend a few days talking to the publishers, but and they're interested in publishing it. So that's another reason, because I want Jludi always wanted to go over the sea. He's a bit fascinated by the ocean, and I want him to go across the sea to another land, and that land will be built on Japan. And when I'm traveling around in the month, I'll draw the whole time I'm there. I'll draw Billy and Jludi in a million locations I'll see what the fauna's like, what the weather's like. and redraw them. And gradually the story will grow in my mind as I draw. So I imagine I'll do it very rough as I'm traveling around. And, when the books are being translated, then I'll say to Penguin, well, I'm going to write this other book. Either you're going to buy it from me, or I'm going to sell it directly to a Japanese publisher, or I'll sell it to someone else, but you have to decide now. And then they'll decide, the woman who said no, actually, strangely enough, last week left. So, maybe they will be interested, but I want to write it no matter what. And I think it really is connected to illustration for me. It was shaped by that interaction with Adelaide around Little Fur. And those Beely and Schluti characters are just really so strong now. That I can't imagine, I don't know if I'll ever go there again, other than in these 2 series. Maybe, but these are the characters, for me. So it's interesting. I've never been asked that question before.
What is your approach to world and character building?
Usually it always starts with an idea of some kind, some kind of thing that's troubling me, like with Comes the Night, which is what I'm working on right now. And my thought was, well, if we go on the way we are going now, everyone will give everything up for safety. We'll all be living in little boxes just so we're safe from whatever we imagine is out there. And a lot of bad stuff happens. Remember that all that weapons of mass destruction stuff, and that's children overboard. So much is just lies that we just believe. We don't even know what's real anymore, and we're already halfway to believing it. So I thought, what happens if let's pretend that we go ahead in this way? What will happen next? And if climate change isn't addressed, and if what will happen? So I just carried myself forward a little bit in time. And I thought, all the really rich people, what are they going to do? Where are they going to have their coffee if there's nobody working in the coffee shop because they can't live? Where will it be? And then I started to think, how could they create a world where they have all the things they want and everybody's happy and everybody's safe, And so that's what I began with. So I was thinking of all of these things. And then I think, as with The Gathering, just one day the character steps into your mind, and the character is a boy and a young guy, and he has a really crazy friend who's a girl. And those 2 characters, I guess I like this. If I think about it, there's a lot of stories about girls who have guys as friends, or it's that where friendship is the main thing. And sometimes it tips over, but sometimes it doesn't. Like with Matthew and Damien, sometimes it doesn't. It just stays like it is. So here we have a boy who is just before kind of like that whole I'm into girls thing. He's one of those, I was a late starter as a kid. I wasn't out there having relationships. God knows I wouldn't have known what to do with anything. And some kids are like that. They're smart, or they're intellectual, or they're busy thinking about the world, but they're not really there in that kind of like out there having boyfriends sort of stuff, which I think is a little bit, promoted by the media rather than real some of the time. Anyway, so where was I? I was saying about... I've forgotten the question again. So I can conclude it. What was the question?
The character building and world building.
Oh, yeah, character building. Yeah, so the characters just step out, start with the question, and the characters are always are built to carry the question. They're the right shape for the question. When they step up, they contain the question already. It's not like I think, oh, I'll put it in here now. It's like they come and they are the question embodied. And then I just have to send them on the story road. The building of the story, it's an arc of, it's 2 arcs. It's an arc of spirit, how they develop and change and evolve in a story. And the arc of what happens in the world. What are they doing actually? And do they achieve it, or do they fail? So there's that arc. And then there's a larger arc of the world beyond it, which will be affected by whatever it is they're doing. So once you start, that arc is like, when you see just sometimes a bit of a rainbow, and then later on you see more, it's like that. You see that much, so the rest is going to go there. So it's that kind of feeling. You build it as you go. I do anyway.
Did you have a favorite moment to write in any of your series?
A favorite
moment to write?
Oh, well, I'm a bit of a romantic. I really loved in Ella's on White Star. I love that moment when um they're hiding in the corridor and and do you remember? Did you read Alice on?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're hiding in the corridor, and she's there and he's there, and they're really scared. And the next minute, someone's walking towards them, and he kisses her because they're trying to like look like they're, and then it ignites into something else. And I wasn't sure where that relationship was going to go until that very moment. And I just found it so, I was so like, oh, like I wasn't writing it. It just, pardon?
It was such a great part of the story. I loved it.
Yeah, I really love that moment. I really love the moment when, I guess I like the epiphanies a lot too. Like the moment when in uh the Velvet City um where the um the monster jumps at the end,
Mm,
at the end to, to get uh Beely and I always love those quiet moments after the really big thing has happened, when they're safe and they're not undamaged. They're not, it's not easy, but they come to peace in the end. And what I always am looking for is a sense of peace of some kind of resolution of story. Not that's it, everything's going to be good now, but a sense of peace and also purpose. The ends, if I think about the end of Obernewtyn and the end of, and the end of Little Fur and the end of, the Velvet City, the end of all of them, there's this sense now we have work to do. And now we've pushed aside this stuff which we had to do. And now we can do our good, nourishing work of life. And I always like that moment when the character can just live, you know, and have a life of their own, because a lot of them have given their lives to something, or they've had to do something, and they've done it honorably, and they deserve peace at the end. And in life, I don't think that happens very much. So where I am also a romantic, I want my characters after their hard labors to have some peace, So and I like
uh,
to know what they think. I like to know what they feel
yeah.
afterwards. I remember an editor saying to me years ago, Isobelle, you've got to have the action scene. You like talking about what's going to happen before and then what happens afterwards, but you've got to write the scene. I'm like, oh, the battle scene. And some of the best scenes have been battle scenes, because I really had to work to make myself write them and really work at them to make them good. Because what's really interesting to me is what goes on in the mind of the characters before they do something that may change their lives or end them, and afterwards what it feels like to have done something like that. That's really interesting to me in human beings, because I think those big things that happen change us essentially in some way, and they mature us, they make us wise, they make us, I think, kind. Not always, but I think they change us for the better.
Yeah,
So
definitely. How would you describe the Red Queen in 5 words?
oh God. Well, um hmm, God. Apocalyptic. um Vast. um oh God, red is the color that runs through it, the book for me. um Intense. And I suppose, I guess, what could be another word? Well, I was satisfied.
Yeah,
I found the ending, like, when I was writing it, I said to my editor, I can't do this because there's so much pressure. And I said, I'm getting letters every other minute from people saying, don't do this and do that. And they want this to be the best book ever. And I do too, but I don't know how to do that. And
mm,
I don't know how you can possibly please all those people. And she said to me, how you didn't think of anyone when you wrote the rest of the book. You just thought of what you wanted to happen. So just do it the same way. And some people will be pleased. And I thought, okay. So that's how that's how I approached it. It was really, very, very daunting to write that ending. And I had to just go with what I felt was the right thing in the end. So I had a real sense of, you know, of culmination. Yeah, that would be the final word. It culminated properly for me.
I couldn't imagine it ending any other way that it did.
Oh,
I
I'm so
loved
glad
that
to hear
I
you say
loved
that.
that ending. I did it was yeah, it just was the perfect ending for for her that story. So yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad you thought of it, because I expected that there would be some people who would like it and some people who wouldn't. But I did, you can only do the absolute best you can. And I love those characters easily as much as everybody out there did. So I care about them too. But I also feel, people wrote and said, you didn't do this properly and you didn't. And I thought, okay, well, I have I know I couldn't do everything in that book, but
Yeah.
I do have this plan. And as long as I don't die, I've got that.
Did you have a favorite book growing up?
I loved The Land of Far Beyond by Enid Blyton. It's funny because I used to love, all those Enid Blyton books, but I read them now. I tried to read them to my daughter, and I just thought The Magic Faraway Tree. Oh, and a child has to read it. She
Yeah.
loved it, but I can't read it anymore. It's just really bad, and I can't read it. But The Land of Far Beyond, I can read again. It's very, it's got very strong religious underpinnings, but I didn't know that as a kid.
Yeah.
I only saw it as, the really big moral and ethical questions, which was what I was all about, honor and love and truth and justice. So they were caught up in this, what is obviously, it's a retelling of the Pilgrim's Progress. So it rises out of some kind of religious thing. But for me, it wasn't about that. It was a journey to be better, a journey, to be a better person, to be better people. Do you know the story?
I've heard of the story. I haven't had a chance to read it, but
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just
Um,
4 kids who get these, somebody manifests these humps on their back, they're like backpacks, which they can't take off, which are all the burdens they carry. And the adults who go with them get even bigger burdens. And the man who made it happen after they'd been torturing a dog vanishes and said, you have to go to the land of far beyond to get them off. So they set off because they can't live like this anymore. And off they go. And, you know, it was a story in which the things were named. So Mr. Bold was bold, and Mr. Cowardly was Mr. Cowardly. So it was like an inside out story where all of the ethical questions and ideas that I loved were spoken of. And the other thing I really loved was The Mouse and His Child, which was exactly the same thing, a story where it was an inside out story, a story where the story of the spiritual journey of the characters, the arc of what happens inside them is on the outside. It's them, those two little mice looking for self-winding. Like, you can't self-wind. You need other people. That was the lesson of the story ultimately. And so that lesson is made manifest or embodied in the characters. So I always really loved these ones where the characters really embodied that journey for me. So those were probably the two, other than, the Narnia books, which
yeah.
I wanted to get through the
Everyone
world of
everyone.
Narnia.
And do you have a favorite story to read?
How do you mean? Short story?
Sorry, genre. Do you have a favorite genre to read?
Genre to read. Um, I like murder mysteries a lot. Yeah, I love murder mysteries. I love that. Someone once asked me, are you romantic? Do you have to have romance in every book? And I said, well, it's like life. Don't you want a little bit
Mhm.
of romance in your life? So yes, I want some romance in my life. And I like mystery because I think the world is full of mysterious things that I'm curious about. I'm the most curious person I know. I never stop asking questions. People, can you just stop thinking for a minute? I can't tell you. Once I got slapped as a kid and sent home because I was asking too many questions. So that's me. I'm always wondering about things I don't know. So mysteries, yeah, I love murder mysteries. What about you? What do you read?
I love fantasy, and I've always read fantasy growing up, and now I'm sort of going into the romance and
Yeah.
mysteries and everything, just bordering my reading,
Yeah. Well,
especially
of
if
course,
I'm
I love fantasy. Yeah,
yeah.
I absolutely, that is my favorite genre. And science fiction, I like a lot of science fiction.
Mhm.
But, I thought I was imagining you meant aside from the ones that
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
obviously the most
Obviously.
beloved. And so murder mystery, yeah, those are the other ones I like. I like poetry though. I really, really love poetry as well.
I can give or take poetry sometimes. I always remember when I was in high school, I struggled to read screenplays when we had to. I just love an actual story. I couldn't just go between the character name and what the line was saying. So
Yeah.
it was always the novels, the fantasy and mystery novels for me.
Yeah. It's interesting because I felt that way about screenplays too, but then I had to write one for the Greylands story and I had to write it over and over. I resisted for a year and then I did it and for years was doing it again and again. And it's amazing when from the point of view of writing one, how much you can begin to see the story. And I think that's how script writers must work. You begin to get inside those moments so that you stop thinking that's character, and he said this, and this is the directions, and you just start flowing through. And you also realize it's not about dialogue, which was what I thought. It's
Yeah.
actually about, what's happening physically, and that you can imagine. So the
Mm.
characters are speaking, but I'm imagining as I write what visually they'll be doing, and therefore what I can cut out of the words. So it's interesting. It's an interesting process, but I prefer books above all else. And I don't want choose your own bloody adventure
No,
books. I want to
no.
know what the writer thought, and that's the book I want.
Yes, exactly. No options for me, please.
Yeah, I know. Why? Do
No.
your job, writer.
Yeah, that were all my questions. Oh,
That's great.
yeah.
Oh, I know. I'm sorry. I went on for hours and we've almost reached, I think probably most people have a limit of, we've almost reached your limit probably. Anyway, I think you can get a transcript off this so you won't have to type it all out
Yeah,
again.
no, I had a look before and I've worked out how to get the transcript, so it will be good.
That's great. All right. All righty. That's good.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
so
much.
much.
My pleasure. It absolutely was. Hey, listen, I wouldn't mind if you would give me permission, I wouldn't mind a copy of this. I have like a Patreon site,
Mhm.
and I only have 40 people on it, so I'm not a promoter. People keep saying if you would just promote it, and I can't. They discover it or they don't. But if you would give me permission, I would of course name you as the interviewer, and just let them see it.
Yeah,
Like I would just post it on there. No one will see it, but those 40 people. So is that
no,
okay?
yeah, that's fine. I'll give you the permissions.
It was a really nice interview. Believe me, I don't do it for every interview. Only the ones where you get me to say something interesting.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Emily.
Have a lovely night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.